My name is Jerry, and when I was 20-year-old, I remember that my C and Mike start a pet sitting for a few years, and the job he took for Mrs. Forsyth seemed like a typical gig. She was an elderly woman who needed someone to look after her 3 cats while she visited her family for the week. Mike had taken care of cats before and found the routine simple and pleasant. Mrs. Forsyth explained that her cats, especially Bella, were very attached to her. Bella, a sleek black cat with bright green eyes, was particularly affectionate and would sit by the front door meowing for hours if she knew Mrs. Forsyth was gone. Mike smiled and reassured her he'd take good care of them. The first couple of days went without incident. Mike fed the cats, cleaned the litter boxes, and spent time with them, making sure they felt comfortable in their owner's absence. But on the 3rd night, something felt off. As Mike was cleaning the litter box in the laundry room, he noticed Bella sitting in the hallway, staring intently at the guest room door. Her tail was flicking erratically, and her ears were flattened against her head, a sign of deep agitation. Mike shrugged it off as a cat being a cat, but as he moved closer, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He checked the guest room, but it was empty. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet, when he turned back to Bella, her eyes were still locked on the door, her body tense and her growls low. He tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't take her eyes off the door. By 11 p.m., Bella's behavior had only escalated. She darted around the house, her eyes fixed on seemingly nothing, her body zigzagging through the rooms. She hissed at empty spaces, then suddenly stopped, as if listening to something Mike couldn't hear. Mike followed her movements, feeling a growing unease creep up his spine. Was there something he was missing? Some creature in the house he couldn't see? Around 2 a.m., just as Mike was about to drift off to sleep, he was jolted awake by a loud crashing sound coming from the kitchen. He scrambled out of bed, heart pounding in his chest. The house was still dark, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. As he made his way downstairs, he turned the corner into the kitchen and froze. All the cabinet doors were wide open. Pots and pans were scattered across the floor, as if someone had gone through them in a hurry. And perched on the counter, staring directly at him, was Bella. Her back arched and her fur standing on end. She growled softly, a deep rumbling sound, and didn't move a muscle. "Bella?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. But the cat just kept her eyes locked on him, her growl escalating. Fearing whatever had disturbed the kitchen might still be around, Mike quickly shut the cabinet doors and made sure all the windows were locked. He didn't feel comfortable being alone in the house anymore, but the idea of leaving made him even more anxious. Instead, he decided to sleep in the living room, leaving all the lights on in the house. If anything else happened, at least he'd be able to see it coming. But just before dawn, as he lay wide awake on the couch, he heard something faint, a soft whisper. It was so quiet at first, he thought it was just the house settling, but then it grew louder, and it sounded as if someone was calling his name, low and hushed. Mike's heart raced. He sat up and looked around the room, but the house was still and dark, save for the dim glow from the hallway. As he turned his head toward the hallway, his blood ran cold. Standing there, just outside the guest room door, was the figure of an old woman. She was wearing a long, tattered dress that looked like it had been through decades of wear. Her hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow. And then, without saying a word, she slowly raised her arm and pointed at Mike. He couldn't move. His body froze, his eyes locked on hers as the woman's figure started to fade, her form dissolving into thin air. Just as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone. Mike didn't know what to think. He sat in stunned silence, his mind racing with disbelief. Was it a dream? Was he imagining things from the stress of the last few days? But when he looked over at Bella, who was now sitting on the couch next to him, staring at the hallway with the same wide-eyed look she'd had before, he knew this was no dream. He didn't tell Mrs. Forsythe about what happened when she returned. There was no way she'd believe him, and besides, the job was over. But as he drove away from her house that morning, he couldn't shake the feeling of the old woman's eyes on him. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be explained away, no matter how hard he tried. Mike never returned to pet sit for Mrs. Forsythe again, and every time he passed her street, he couldn't help but glance at the old house, wondering if Bella and the other cats still watched that guest room door, waiting for someone or something to return. Now, I tell the true story of my best friend. His name is Emma, and when Emma was a college student looking for extra cash when the Johnsons asked her to sit their 2 corgis, Benny and Bella, for a weekend. The Johnsons lived in a charming old house just outside of town, and their friendly demeanor made Emma feel at ease. They gave her a tour of the house, explained the corgis' feeding schedule, and pointed out the essentials. Everything seemed straightforward, except for one odd detail. As they walked past the basement door, Emma noticed it was secured with several heavy-duty locks. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect in a family home. She gestured toward it, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, that," Mrs. Johnson said with a nervous laugh. "The basement's just old. We keep it locked to avoid any accidents. Don't worry about it. The dogs won't go near it anyway." Emma thought the explanation was strange, but didn't press further. After all, her job was to take care of Benny and Bella, not question the house's quirks. The first day passed uneventfully. The corgis were playful and affectionate, and Emma found herself enjoying their company. By the time night fell, the house was quiet, and Emma felt completely at ease. That changed around midnight. She was curled up on the couch watching TV when Benny and Bella suddenly perked up. They stared at the basement door, ears twitching. A low growl escaped Benny's throat, and Bella whimpered, backing away. Emma muted the TV, her heart racing. "Relax, guys," she said, though her voice wavered. Then she heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the other side of the basement door. Emma froze. The sound was soft at first, like nails dragging against wood, but it grew louder and more insistent. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind or some old pipes, but the dog's behavior made her doubt it. Grabbing her phone, Emma walked toward the door, her palms sweating. She pressed her ear against it, holding her breath. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. Relief washed over her, and she laughed nervously. "See? Nothing to worry about," she told the dogs, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. But as she turned to walk away, there was a loud bang. Emma jumped, spinning around to face the door. The dogs barked furiously now, their tails tucked between their legs. "Okay, that's enough," Emma muttered, trying to steady her nerves. She called the Johnsons, but the call went straight to voicemail. Deciding there was nothing more she could do, Emma ushered the dogs upstairs, hoping the incident was over. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., she was jolted awake by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the basement. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The dogs were huddled close to her, trembling. The footsteps grew louder, climbing the stairs. Then came the sound of the locks rattling, one by one. Emma's blood turned to ice as the final lock clicked open. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice barely a whisper as she explained what was happening. The operator stayed on the line, trying to keep her calm, but Emma's terror grew as she heard the basement door creak open. She clutched Benny and Bella, waiting in silence. The sound of footsteps moved through the house, slow and methodical. The creak of the stairs told her whatever it was coming closer. Finally, she heard the distant wail of sirens. The footsteps stopped abruptly and the house fell silent again. Emma stayed frozen in place until the police arrived, banging on the front door. The officers searched the house but found no one. However, when they inspected the basement, they made a chilling discovery. There were clear signs that someone had been living down there: discarded clothes, a mattress, and empty food wrappers. Even more unsettling, a set of muddy footprints led from the basement stairs to the front door, but there were no prints leading out. When the Johnsons returned the next day, Emma confronted them, furious they hadn't warned her. Mr. Johnson looked shaken. "We didn't think it was necessary," he admitted. "We thought the locks would keep it contained." "It?" Emma demanded, her voice rising. Mrs. Johnson's face was pale as she said, "We don't know who or what it is. It's been there since we moved in. We just try to ignore it." Emma didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her things, left the house, and vowed never to pet sit again. But sometimes, late at night, she swore she could still hear the faint sound of scratching in her dreams. M.Y. Uncle Samantha loved animals. Growing up, her home was a mini zoo of cats, dogs, and even a rabbit or two. So, when the Thompsons asked her to pet sit for their cat, Whiskers, she didn't hesitate to accept. Their home, a charming two-story Victorian nestled in a sleepy neighborhood, was a stark contrast to her tiny apartment in the city. The idea of spending a weekend there, surrounded by vintage charm and the company of a friendly feline, seemed idyllic. As the Thompsons walked her through the house, they provided the usual instructions: food portions, favorite toys, and where Whiskers liked to nap. Near the end of the tour, Mrs. Thompson casually added, "Oh, and sometimes the lights flicker. Old wiring, you know how it is." Samantha nodded, unfazed. A bit of flickering lights wasn't going to ruin her weekend. That evening, after a light dinner and some unpacking, Samantha settled into the living room. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of its aging frame. Whiskers curled up beside her on the couch, purring contentedly as she flipped through her book. Everything seemed perfect until Whiskers suddenly leapt to the floor. His posture changed instantly, back arched, fur bristling, and eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. Samantha put her book down, confused. "What's wrong, buddy?" she murmured, but Whiskers didn't respond. He remained frozen, staring into the shadows. Then the lights in the hallway began to flicker. Samantha's heart skipped. She forced a nervous chuckle. "Old wiring," she muttered, repeating Mrs. Thompson's words. But the eerie behavior of the cat unsettled her. She decided to distract herself, picking up her phone and scrolling through social media. That's when she caught it. A fleeting shadow, just at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply toward the hallway, but it was empty. The flickering had stopped, leaving only silence. She shook her head, laughing nervously. "It's just a house. Stop scaring yourself." Still, an uneasy feeling clung to her as she made her way to bed. At 2 a.m., Samantha was jolted awake by a sound. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the house. At first, her groggy mind thought the Thompsons had returned, but a quick glance at her phone reminded her they were gone until Monday. Her chest tightened. She listened intently as the footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside her door. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, as if on cue, a low growl broke the stillness. Whiskers. Heart pounding, Samantha grabbed her phone and turned on its flashlight. The beam quivered in her unsteady hand as she opened the door. The hallway stretched before her, dark and empty. But there, at the far end, was Whiskers, crouched low, growling at nothing. She called his name softly. The cat didn't budge, his green eyes locked on an invisible threat. Suddenly, the footsteps resumed, this time behind her. Samantha spun around, her light scanning the room, but it revealed nothing. Yet the air felt different, heavy and cold, pressing against her skin. Then she heard it. A faint whisper, unintelligible but chilling, brushing past her ear. Panicked, she scooped up Whiskers and darted back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She shoved a chair under the doorknob and huddled on the bed, clutching the trembling cat. Every creak of the old house set her nerves on edge. The night dragged on, every minute feeling like an eternity. Samantha didn't sleep. By dawn, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, but the memory of the night's events lingered, vivid and raw. She called the Thompsons as soon as the sun rose. Her voice was shaky as she demanded they return immediately. To their credit, they didn't argue, promising to be back by afternoon. When they arrived, Samantha wasted no time recounting her experience. As she spoke, their cheerful demeanor faded. Mr. Thompson glanced uneasily at his wife, who sighed deeply. "We should have told you," Mr. Thompson admitted. "You're not the first sitter to experience something." "What do you mean?" Samantha asked, her voice rising with frustration. "The house has a history," Mrs. Thompson said hesitantly. "We've heard things, seen things. Our last sitter swore she saw a man walking down the hallway. She left that night and never came back." Samantha stared at them in disbelief. "And you didn't think to warn me?" Mrs. Thompson offered a weak smile. "He's harmless, really. He just walks around sometimes." Harmless. The word echoed mockingly in Samantha's mind. She packed her things in silence, her hands trembling with anger and fear. As she drove away, relief began to wash over her. The house grew smaller in her rearview mirror, but just as she turned a corner, she glanced back one last time. There, in the upstairs window, was a figure, tall, shadowy, and unmistakably watching her leave. Samantha Never Pet sat again,